Blessings, beloveds. I am going to take about 10 minutes to do some astrology again, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about Michael Jackson, somebody that I'm really fond of and have been very fond of since I was a little girl. I've loved his music my entire life. I want to talk about what's called the 10th house in an astrological horoscope, and I have Michael's chart here. So as you can see there's his name, time, date and place of birth, and there's his actual chart. Okay, the 10th house is just right there where you can see those two planets. That's Chiron and that's the moon. And what I'm going to focus on today is actually Chiron. Now, first of all, just a couple of points on the 10th house. The 10th house describes our public life from the point of view of what we're doing in our lives professionally. So all our ambitions, our drives, our successes, and what we do to achieve all of that is described by the 10th house. So when we look at the 10th house, we look at the sign on the cusp, we look at what rules that house, and we look at any planets in that house as well. And also planets that might be forming a relationship to that house through something called an aspect. Now, in Michael's case, we have Chiron right there. That's really significant for Michael, and it really does actually describe his life. Chiron is something that the myth of Chiron is absolutely fascinating. It's actually the in terms of Sagittarius, the man on the horse, the centaur. So that's actually Chiron. So in the myth, he was wounded quite severely on a physical level. But in terms of how that plays out in our own life, when Chiron is wherever it is in the chart, it's actually showing us where we are potentially wounded or will experience a sense of wounding in our own life. Now that wounding can be, literally in a physical level, or it can be emotional and psychological or spiritual as well, or it can be all of that together. If you had Chiron in the first house, for instance, you might be born with some kind of physical deformity, so it can be literal in that sense. For Michael Jackson, Chiron in the 10th house is really talking about his experience of being wounded by the public. The 10th house is the public, literally, so it's the whole cosmos, the whole world out there, and one's experience of that. So Michael Jackson having Chiron in the 10th, he was literally wounded by the public, and let's think about that. It's pretty obvious. I mean, he went through years of people scrutinizing him, judging him, accusing him, labeling him, of all sorts of terrible things. And he had moon in Pisces, so we're talking about a really sensitive soul, a beautiful sensitive soul that didn't deserve to be treated in that way. And that's not just my opinion. I think a lot of people would agree with that. But yeah, just getting back to Chiron in the 10th house, quite apart from his creative self, his creative journey and his mastery, actually I should say, in his artistry and what he created, which is seen in other aspects of his chart, his actual experience of how he felt in the public eye was through that Chiron. So he was deeply affected and deeply wounded by years and years of all the torture that he went through. The other interesting thing in his chart with the moon in the 10th house is always reflecting our mother, our birth mother in our life. Now, Michael Jackson's mother was a very prominent figure in his life, and she really did take care of him, and she did nurture him to her best ability and he was very fond of her and very, very close with her. So that shows that relationship between Michael and his mother, with the moon in the 10th house. So the moon is his own emotional and mental state, but it's also symbolizing the connections that he had with women and his own mother. So the feminine principle is quite strong in Michael's chart. And if you think about a lot of the connections he had, I mean, he had connections with many, many people across the board, both in his personal life and artistically. But he had very powerful connections with some women, such as Diana Ross, and several others as well. So that's just pointing to the important connections that he had with the feminine energy in his life, and the primary one being his mother, which is the moon. Moon is always mother. But despite that, because of the moon being in Pisces, which meant that he was an incredibly sensitive soul, which also meant that he was incredibly artistic and creative, and his imagination was out of this world, literally out of this world. His imagination did not belong to this 3D reality. And if we look at his work and his videos and his creativity and everything that he produced, we can actually see there was magic in his work. There was literally magic in his work. But he lived through that Chiron. He was a deeply wounded soul. Now, the 10th house has in opposition to it the 4th house, because every house is opposite another house. So the opposite house being the 4th, just to touch on this very briefly, and as you can see, there's a lot of energy down there, a lot of action. He has the Sun and Pluto just down there in the 4th house. That's his father. So the sun sign is him. It's his personality and his expression, and it was in Virgo. So Michael was a perfectionist, and indeed he was. You look at his craft and his art. He worked really hard to create and develop what he did, on stage and in his record studios and all of that. You think about all the smash hits that he had, and the awards that he won, all of that. That just didn't fall out of the sky. He worked really hard. He started working in that industry from, I think, the age of 5. He was singing. So he had Sun Pluto, and that Sun Pluto is what gave him that drive, that willpower, that determination, and that ability to continue to reinvent himself and recreate in his artistry, which is what he did. But that Sun Pluto also describes his father, and his father was very controlling, quite abusive, quite manipulative, and really controlled Michael's life, and that wasn't a good experience for Michael. But that's a whole other level down there. What I really wanted to emphasize today was just the 10th house and how important. Every house is important, but we're just talking about the importance of the 10th house, and how that is experienced and viewed and seen publicly. And Michael was a very public person, so we got to see a lot about his life. But unfortunately, a lot of what was focused on, particularly in the last sort of 2 decades of his life, was very negative and dark, and it was very lower astral stuff. It was dark forces sort of trying to really destroy him and destroy his life, and eventually that did happen. That's Chiron. He was deeply wounded. So if you've got planets in the 10th house, they are really going to describe how that part of your life is operating, how it's playing out, whether it's flowing, whether it's blocked, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, and that applies to every single house, obviously. But the 10th house it's the most elevated point in the chart, and it's above the horizon, so it's the most elevated point. And when people have a lot of planets around here, they're often very, very successful, but success can sometimes come at quite a big cost as well, emotionally and psychologically, for many people, and it does for many artists. And in the case of Michael, it was Chiron that really describes, just his experience of the trauma and the suffering that he went through. But again, you know, there's many levels and layers into a birth chart, and to be able to actually have a birth chart and have the locality of all the different planets and what we call asteroids, and there are certain other points in the chart as well, such as the nodes, and there's all sorts of things happening. You need the right time of birth. Now, a lot of people either don't have a time of birth or work with the wrong time of birth. And a lot of astrologers will just work with whatever time a person gives them, and so be it, and they just leave it at that. But that in turn describes the inaccuracy of the interpretation of a person's chart at times, and certainly with regards to looking at predictions and things like that. So looking at the next 6 to 12 months of a person's life, if you don't have the time of birth right, then everything that you're seeing is out of sync. It's out of whack. So time of birth is crucial, and time of birth is chosen by you. It's chosen by the soul that chooses to incarnate into this body and chooses to have all these experiences that it chooses to have. It's not a random thing. You're not born accidentally at that time. You're not born accidentally into your family. You know, life is... It is chosen. The soul chooses what it wishes to experience, and that's just how it is. So time of birth is really crucial, guys, and I'm a big one on that, and that's because that's how I learned. I learned from some great people, as I've mentioned previously, and I know the importance of time of birth from this astrological level that we're talking about. So I will do a video on the 11th house, which I said that I would. The house of the guardian angels, and many other things as well. Each house is a development of the previous house. So, you know, everything's linked, everything's connected. That expression, all is one, is fundamentally true, because this fabric in life that we experience and that we are born into, and that becomes our journey, and that turns and changes, it is all one, and you can actually see it through the birth chart, because everything is linked, absolutely everything. And like I mentioned in my last video, the cycle of Aries, which starts here and goes all the way around, ends at Pisces, is the beginning and the completion of the individuation process, as Carl Jung coined. Which is our ego's development and psychological processes, which is birthed, and then right at the end of Pisces it surrenders. So there is a lot to astrology, there is a lot to understand, and I'm not a popular astrologer in that I don't focus on popular sort of astrology. I like to explore things quite deeply, and I like accuracy as well, because that's the way I've learned. So sometimes I make comments about, you know, the moon's in Sag today, or, you know, earlier I wrote the moon's in Capricorn and it's conjunct Pluto for a few hours. That's a collective experience, you know, and that can be very powerful depending on what you choose to do with that. You know, if you're working with healing through some things in your life right now, well, tonight would be a great time to actually delve deeper into some emotional patterns and emotional restrictions to free yourself up. So these little planetary sort of movements that take place, when I say little, I'm sort of talking about